Hello. My presentation is about the accountability of the Parliament and the subtopics for the syllabus being elections for the House of Representatives and the Senate, accountability by the Privileges Committee for both houses, the accountability of the Parliament through the procedures and the processes of the Parliament, and finally by the judicial review conducted by courts. The first thing to consider when we're thinking about accountability is what is the Parliament accountable for? So here we need to go back to syllabus topic 2, effectively, from Unit 3, which is the functions of the Parliament. So the Parliament does 3 things. It legislates, it forms government, and it represents. And part of the conduct of the Parliament and the culture of the Parliament should be representative of the people as well, not just the representation of issues and concerns. So the way Parliament conducts itself, conducts its business, and the behaviour of parliamentarians is part of the representation function. The syllabus needs us to look at 4 ways in which the Parliament is accountable for those 3 things. The first is elections. So this is the ballots held every 3 years for the House of Representatives and the Senate. They're held jointly. The procedures and the processes, i.e. the rules by which Parliament runs. The privileges committees in both houses. Both houses do that slightly differently, but they both have privileges committees that monitor the performance and the behaviour of members of Parliament. And finally, the review of the Parliament itself, its membership, the eligibility of its members, but importantly, its legislation. And so it must be constitutional, and it is the role of the courts to do those things. Depicting those things visually, we can see that the electoral process is the way in which the citizens of Australia hold the Parliament to account. So that means that the Parliament is accountable to the people, following the blue line or the blue arrow. And I just wanted to point out that this is a very strong form of accountability because the Parliament is directly elected by the people. It is the only branch of government which is our executive branch is elected, but it is indirectly elected, not directly. So the accountability of the Parliament to the people is the most robust form of accountability because the people can effectively renew their Parliament every 3 years if they're not satisfied with the way it's conducted its representation, its legislation, and its government functions. Then moving on, know the rules and the privileges committees, those are both mechanisms through which the Parliament is accountable to itself effectively. So when people or institutions are accountable to themselves or to people close to them, then it is a fairly weak form of accountability because it lacks that distance, it lacks that separation, and the checks and balances are inherently weaker. So we will look at that as we progress. Finally, independent courts are also independent of the Parliament. We know that from looking at rule of law and the independence of the judiciary and other parts of the syllabus. And we learn that the third branch of government, the courts, are very influential in holding not just Parliament, but governments to account as well. So they are an essential component of the accountability mechanisms for holding Parliament to account. And I note that that is also a strong form of accountability. So of the 4, elections and judicial review would certainly be more, if you were evaluating these processes in an essay, which is highly likely, you would definitely single out elections and judicial review as the 2 most robust forms of accountability of the Parliament because of their independence, essentially. The procedures and processes are subject to the Parliament, and so are the committee processes, which weakens them. So diving deeply into the accountability through elections, we can see this is a complex slide, and apologies for all the information on it, but we'll work our way through from left to right. So essentially, we've got the people there on the left. These are qualified electors, of which there are some 16 or 17 million in Australia, and we have compulsory voting in Australia, which means that there is a very high turnout and that the issues are generally voted on rather than personalities and so on. So political parties don't have to mobilise the vote. They can rely on the fact that people will turn out. So people are more informed perhaps than they would otherwise be. We have two houses of parliament, and so we have two different electoral systems. You would know that from year 11. If we start with the bottom one, the House of Representatives, so following the green arrow, we see that the people, the electors, choose the House of Representatives. Section 24 of the Constitution says that the House of Representatives shall be directly chosen by the people, but the method of choosing is up to the Parliament itself, and the Parliament has chosen the preferential voting system for the people to elect it, for the elector's lower house at least. This is a relatively simple system, which is good for accountability because people know how to vote. You get high rates of formal voting, and people can express their wishes quite confidently using the system. It's a small ballot paper with a list of candidates, and you just have to number preferentially, as you know. Now, following this further through, we can see that the House of Representatives, every member of the House of Representatives, currently 151 MPs or MHRs, are accountable every 3 years. So that's quite a high frequency. That's not quite as often as the House of Representatives in the US, which is every 2 years, arguably too often. Other similar liberal democracies like Britain have electoral cycles up to 5 years. So Australia's is quite short, and there are problems with that, but in terms of just accountability, that's very good. Okay, so the House and the MPs must face the people every 3 years. So they're acutely aware of the fact that they will face the judgment of their constituents in their electorates every 3 years. It keeps them on their toes. Following on there, we see a number 1 in a big circle. That represents the fact that every MP represents a single electorate. Put that another way, each electorate has only one MP, which means if that MP is underperforming or not representing adequately or failing to conduct their legislative role to the satisfaction of the 110 or so thousand electors in their electorate, they know who to blame for that. They know who to hold to account. So the fact there's only one MP, a member of the House of Representatives per electorate, makes them relatively easy to target if the electors are dissatisfied with them. There's nowhere for them to hide. So holding the House to account through the electoral process, in summary, is quite straightforward. It's frequent. There's only one MP per electorate, and the voting system is simple enough for electors to use it to get rid of MPs they're not happy with or reward the ones that they are. So following on from the House, let's look at the Senate. So back to the people, compulsory voting, and following the red arrow this time. The electoral system here is anything but simple. You would know again from year 11 that the proportional representation single transferable vote, PRSTV, is a complicated system. It has been reformed over the years, first in 1984 and then again in 2016 to make it simpler, but it is still more complex than the lower house electoral system. It's a proportional system, which is good for representation, but it is not a very good system for accountability. The complexity means that lots of voters simply don't know how to use the system to hold senators to account. Most electors, here we're talking mostly over 90%, sometimes as high as 95% of electors will always vote above the line rather than below the line. And if you vote above the line, you are voting for a political party. You're not voting for a senator. So immediately the choice to vote above line means that senators are not being held to account by their electors. They're being held to account by their parties, really. Okay, so people will vote for parties and then parties will choose their senators. So that two-step process makes senators a little bit less accountable, or quite a bit less accountable, through the electoral system than members of the House of Representatives. Some voters do vote below the line, and it is now easier because you don't have to vote all the boxes. You don't have to exhaust all the options, which can be 70 up to 100 boxes to number all the way through. Most electors simply don't do that. They vote above the line because it's simpler. However, now you only have to number 12. It's the minimum. You can go more if you want, but 12 is the minimum. So since 2016, voting above the line has been a little harder. Got to go 1 to 6, and voting below the line has become a lot easier. Got to go 1 to 12. So the idea there is to make it more attractive for electors to vote below the line. We still find, though, since 2016, 19 and 22, 3 elections since this system's been in use, there's been a gradual increase in the number of electors voting below the line, but it's not earth-shattering. Okay, so most still vote above the line. To vote senators and hold them to account as individuals, you must vote below the line. It's the only way to vote for candidates as people, not parties. Okay, so the first thing to note there is the complexity of the system means that most electors simply don't vote for senators, they vote for parties who then choose their senators. That dilutes representation, or rather accountability. Senators are shielded by their parties because electors tend to vote for the party, not for them. The next thing to note is that senators have a 6-year term rather than a 3-year term. So that is because we only elect half the Senate every 3 years. So the half that's not being elected don't face the people, so they're less accountable. A senator at the beginning of their term knows that they won't face the people again for another 6 years. Their colleagues in the lower house are on their toes all the time because they know that 3 years down the track, which is not that long really, they're going to face the people again. A senator has twice that amount of time. So not only are they shielded by complex electoral systems, they are also shielded by the fact that voters may forgive them or forget about what they've done in terms of representational legislation over the past 6 years. And finally, in the circle with the 6 in it, that is intended to show that the proportional representation single transferable vote, PRSTV system, means that each electorate is represented by 12 senators, but because we are only electing half at a time, we elect 6 at a normal general election, which is most often the normal election. So with 6 senators to choose from, electors really find it hard to choose which particular senator they want to hold to account. There are 6. So who is responsible for representing you poorly? Who is responsible for legislating in ways you don't like? The only way to hold a senator to account, again, is to vote below the line. And that's what most people don't do. So if we just summarise this, okay, getting from both houses, the preferential voting system is simple. It operates every 3 years to hold a single member to account, and that's very good for accountability. There is nowhere to hide, and it's frequent, and it's a simple system. With the Senate, it's a complicated system most electors don't understand. Most electors default and choose the system that doesn't hold senators to account. Parties will shield their senators, and they're only elected every 6 years. And finally, there are 6 to choose from. So who do you hold to account? Not easy. Okay, so moving up to the top right there, the big star, we can see that one feature of the Australian electoral system which makes it very effective from an accountability point of view is the fact that the politicians, the people in the Senate and the people in the House, don't get to manipulate the electoral system. It is run fairly and independently by a statutory authority called the Australian Electoral Commission, which is charged with administering elections. So that is independent and the system is fair, and that is as good as you can get, really. Okay, so looking at the strategies here, if you want to hold a member of the lower house to account, well, then there are several ways to do this. You can organise community-based campaigns. So we've seen the rise of this as a phenomenon in recent years. The voices of Indi, voices for Warringah, and now the many other TEALs which have been successful in the 2022 election show just how effective the community campaign strategy has become. Other independents are successful in the seat of Fowler, for example. The Labor Party attempted to parachute into that a prominent senator, former New South Wales Premier, and it was the people of Fowler didn't take kindly to that. It's a very ethnically diverse seat, and they wanted a local, so they elected Dai Lee, who is an independent Australian or Vietnamese heritage, to represent them as an alternative to the Labor Party's choice of a parachuted candidate. So again, local issues are really important, and if they're important enough, it can unseat or prevent the election of partisan candidates. Other common systems are to put the sitting member last. That would tend to mean that if the sitting member fails to get 50% plus one first preferences, well then if they're last on everyone's how to vote card, they're not going to benefit from the flow of preferences. Somebody else is likely to win the seat. So even though the major party candidate, who's probably the sitting member, Liberal, Labor, National, is going to get the most votes, they won't get the absolute majority, and that's what matters. So you can unelect, you can get a sitting member out of Parliament with a sitting member last campaign if everything falls your way. Marginal seat campaigns are common, and preference deals between political parties are also a common way. In the Senate, it's a little bit more complicated. Below the line strategies are essential if you are trying to win a Senate seat without the backing of a major party. You cannot win above the line. You must go below the line, which is called a below the line strategy or campaign. There's been one prominent example in 2016 when the new electoral system reforms came into effect. Lisa Singh won her Senate seat back. She's a Labor senator. She was moved to a position that was unelectable on the ticket, on Labor's ticket. So she couldn't get elected by people voting Labor above the line. So she campaigned in Tasmania for Tasmanians to vote below the line. And they did in sufficient numbers for her to win her seat back. Erica Betts was a Liberal senator from Tasmania who attempted the same strategy at the last election in 2022, but he failed to achieve a quota. Just a point here, both Lisa and Eric are Tasmanians. And what we should note here is that Tasmanians will vote below the line on a far greater percentage than other Australians. This is because they use a similar system to proportional representation, single transferable vote, to elect the Tasmanian Parliament. The same is the case in the ACT. So we've got two states or territories in Australia which are familiar with complex voting proportional representation systems, and they will use it in the Senate voting, whereas we see very low levels of voting below the line in other states. So that's the electoral, the accountability of the Parliament through elections. It is a very robust form of accountability. It is more robust in the House than in the Senate for the reasons explained. Australia does have an outstanding electoral system. It is independently administered by the AEC. It is fair. It has a compromise which is designed to provide good representation and so on. But it does deliver from the narrow lens of accountability. It's much better in the House than it is in the Senate. Okay, so what kinds of things? Here are your examples. Now you know how the electoral systems work. In essays and complex questions, you need to have evidence and examples for high marks. So each of these tables represents the three functions of the Parliament: the legislative function, the representative function, and the forming and holding government accountable function. So the 46th Parliament was the Parliament which selected the Morrison government. But remember, we are focusing on the Parliament here, not the government. So the 46th Parliament really failed to legislate for climate. There's no attempt at all to introduce any effective climate bill or legislation that would reduce Australia's emissions or contributions to greenhouse gas emissions and global warming. That was something that became a big issue in the last 2 or 3 years, especially following bushfires and floods in the eastern states, especially, and events around the world, and the other issues that are pushing Australia towards getting more serious about climate action. The last Parliament was simply dragging its heels, and the people felt that they needed to change it for that, or hold it accountable for that. The second was integrity. We had issues concerning government accountability here, and it's the job of the Parliament to hold the government to account. That's what the third table says. And one of the ways that could have happened is if the 46th Parliament had effectively legislated some integrity legislation that forced governments to be accountable. They failed to do that, so the people have elected a new Parliament with new MPs who are more willing to introduce integrity legislation. And finally, if you recall, early in the year, the religious discrimination bill turned into a bit of a fiasco. The idea of a religious discrimination bill sitting alongside race, sex, disability and age discrimination bills as Australia's package of anti-discrimination bills was a good idea. I mean, it's a good thing, really. but it turned into really a culture war over transgender rights. And whereas most Australians can understand the need for a religious discrimination bill, they were not happy with a religious discrimination law which enabled people to discriminate against other people on the basis of religious belief. So that bill was highly controversial, resulted in the most significant floor crossing in Australia's post-war history, and was defeated. So Parliament just didn't get that right, and they were held to account for that. On the subject of representation, there's a lack of women in Parliament generally, especially in the lower house, but also the Brittany Higgins events over the last couple of years have highlighted the concerns that many people have now for the treatment of women in Parliament, not just members of Parliament, but people who work there. It's a huge building with lots of people who work, of course, in all kinds of jobs, but women are not protected in Parliament from sexual harassment as in every other workplace in the country. And so there were, the Brittany Higgins case highlighted that and became a lightning rod for the issue of women's representation in the Parliament, in the Houses, but also in the Parliament as a workplace. So again, the failure of the Parliament to adequately represent and even protect women has become an issue that it was held to account for. There's a general lack of diversity, especially in the lower house. That's something else we need to consider. The election of Dai Li in Fowler is a really good example of a highly ethnically diverse electorate wanting to be represented by someone who looks like they do. Okay, so that's important. There's a lack of local representation. The Teals are a really good example of that kind of thing, as is Fowler. More and more independents are getting elected, and that is a reflection of the lack of representation by big parties of local issues. So there's a kind of increasing localisation of representation going on over the last several elections. And the behaviour of MPs has been judged by the people to be too partisan, hyper-partisan almost, like winning the political points in Parliament has become more important than representing the people in the views of many electors. Finally, Parliament is responsible for holding the government accountable. It forms the government. It does that very well, but it's not so great at holding governments to account. So we've had examples, for example, the sports rorts affair, car park rorts affair, general issues about how government spends grant money, often for pork barrelling purposes. Pork barrelling is this spending of government money for political advantage, and it's really unethical. It's very common, but it is not the right thing to do, and many people are just a bit sick of that. So they want Parliament to crack down on those sorts of things that governments try to do. Remember, this is about the accountability of the Parliament, not the government. But here the Parliament must hold government to account. So if it is not adequately doing that, people will hold the Parliament to account. There's a perceived lack of integrity in politics generally at the moment, something that people want to address. That's why they wanted the integrity bill. And question time and other parliamentary procedures are not particularly effective. People are turned off by the behaviour of MPs during question time. Many MPs, particularly on the government benches, backbenchers, simply are puppets of the ministers. They ask Dorothy Dixers, as you know, and I think the people are kind of on to this now, and they want a little bit better from the Parliament. Certainly what they voted for in 2022. On the left is the House of Representatives from the 46th Parliament and the new House of Representatives from the 47th Parliament. So we can see that there's a couple of things changed here. First of all, there's been a change of government, of course, but we must remember we are dealing with the Parliament here. So let's leave the government out of this and just look at ideologies and so on. Okay, so we can see that there is, or was in the 46th Parliament, a Conservative majority made up of Liberal MHRs, National MHRs, who held something like 72 seats. They were able to form government as a result of that. But we are focused here on a lower house Conservative majority. And now if we look at the 47th House of Representatives, or the House of Representatives of the 47th Parliament, we see that there is a progressive majority has been elected to replace the Conservative majority. So if we look at Conservative politics versus progressive politics, Australians really wanted more on the environmental front, on the integrity front, on perhaps social welfare and so on. COVID has probably been a big factor. People have seen what governments can do and maybe they want a bit more of that. Okay, so there's the switch in the majorities from conservative to progressive. And the other thing to note is the Teals, Greens and other independents, who together form the largest crossbench in Australia's political history in the House of Representatives. So the Teals really are a phenomenon. They began to be, I guess the strategy was developed by Cathy McGowan in the seat of Indi, Voices for Indi. It was adopted by Zali Steggall in Warringah to unseat Tony Abbott, a former Liberal Prime Minister, and has proven that it works. The Voices of whatever electorate, insert name of electorate. The Voices of strategy is a community campaigning strategy that has proven its worth in Indi, unseated a former Prime Minister in Warringah, and been adopted and financed by Climate 200, a very significant pressure group that is going to be influencing lawmaking quite a lot through getting elected candidates into Parliament. We've seen that now there is a large number of independents in the House, and they are another part of the phenomenon. They campaigned on climate and integrity, and most of them are women. All of them are women. The Greens had a 400% increase in representation, which is an indication of the number of electors around Australia, especially in inner city electorates in Melbourne and Brisbane, who want action on climate change. Flipping over to the Senate, on the right, top right, is the Senate of the 46th Parliament. On the bottom right is the Senate of the 47th Parliament. And we can see, once again, the flipping of the majorities from a conservative majority in the upper house of the 46th to a progressive majority in the upper house of the 47th. Just note there's a large crossbench rather, and there is a teal independent in the grey square there on the crossbench of the Senate. That's David Pocock, and he's from the ACT. So yes, bottom line is that the Australian electors effectively rejected conservative majorities in both houses and replaced them with progressive majorities. Looking at procedures and processes, these essentially are the rules by which Parliament operates and runs. The Speaker of the House of Representatives and the President of the Senate are the umpires who enforce the rules. Generally speaking, these are, well, they're very good. They can be weakened though, but depending on the character of the Speaker and the President. If the Speaker and the President act in a partisan way and support the government, because it will be the government that chooses them, well, in a biased way, well, then that will undermine the procedures and the processes, because they simply can't operate free of government interference. And that lack of independence is what undermines them as an accountability mechanism. So point number one, the Speaker is essential if procedures and processes are going to work properly. They have to be good at their job, and they have to be able to withstand the pressure of the Prime Minister and the government, who essentially are their bosses in the political parties. The last Speaker of the House was, well, he's just retired. The last significant Speaker with a decent history of being a Speaker is Tony Smith. That's a picture of him on the left. And he is well regarded as a Speaker because even though he's from the Liberal Party, he did act independently and ran the House according to the standing orders. So the two circles, standing orders in the green and order of business in the red, in the red circle, are the two things you really need to know. The standing orders is the rule book. Each house has its own standing orders. They are pretty much there all the time, hence standing. They don't change a lot. They do evolve over time, but it's a slow process. Each day, though, every house produces an order of business. It's like an agenda of what the house will do that day. In the House, it is called the order of business, and in the Senate, it's called the red. It's basically a timetable, I guess a bit like a school timetable. It says at this time, there will be morning prayers. At this time, there will be government business. At this time, there will be private members' business. At this time, there will be question time, and so on. So like a timetable keeps students accountable for their time at school, the order of business and the red keep the MPs accountable for how they, the things that they do during a sitting day. And so over on the right-hand side, we can see the three roles or three functions of the Parliament. Again, it must legislate, it must represent, and it must hold government responsible. So there are rules for each of those functions. The legislative process or the statutory process is the process for turning a bill into a law. Not going to reiterate that here. That's year 11, and you should understand that very well, but it is all governed by rules and procedures, how the votes are done, whether or not there's a division or the vote is on the voices, etc., who can contribute, the roles of committees in the legislative process, all governed by standing orders. Representation also is supported by various rules. There are 90-second statements that any MHR or senator can make to the House. There are urgency motions, matters of public importance, and at the very end of every sitting day is an adjournment debate, half an hour or so, where any MP can speak on any topic they like. Okay, so these standing orders and orders of business contain opportunities for representation. Finally, there are procedures in the House and in the Senate, mostly in the House, because that's the House that holds the government responsible, which do that. So that's question time, the procedures around individual and collective ministerial responsibility, so the moving of motions of censure and motions of no confidence, who gets to debate those and how they're voted on, etc. All of that is governed by rules. Okay, so let's look at some examples. This is Tony Smith with the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, at the time, in May 2021, so a year before the election. Quite a controversial contest between these two gentlemen. They're both members of the Liberal Party. Scott Morrison is the leader of the Liberal Party and Tony Smith is a member of the Liberal Party. So in party sense, Scott is Tony's boss, but in a parliamentary sense, Tony is the boss of the House and Scott must follow the rules of the House, which Tony upholds. So Tony Smith, as I said earlier, a very good example of a good speaker. He said, quote, to the House of Representatives, quote, "I'm just making very clear to the House members, might be happy to behave in an unparliamentary way every single question time. I'm not prepared for that to continue. I'm making it very clear." So that is Tony Smith addressing the whole House and basically drawing them into line and saying that their conduct is unparliamentary during question time. He's not going to stand for it. Later on, the Prime Minister was answering a question asked by the opposition, and the Prime Minister was waxing lyrical or going off topic and talking about what he wanted. In fact, he'd turned the question into an attack on the opposition instead of answering the question. The Speaker said to the Prime Minister, "I'm asking you to return to the question. So, Mr. Morrison, please return to the question. Stop attacking the opposition." And the Prime Minister responded, "I'm happy to do that, Mr. Speaker." And then Tony Smith says, "I don't care whether you're happy or not. You need to return to the question." So this made news at the time. I mean, these sorts of things hardly ever make news, but it was quite profound to have the Speaker dressing the Prime Minister down and forcing him to return to the question. That's what a good Speaker should do. And that is the rules holding the Parliament to account. This fellow is the member for the seat of Bruce in Victoria. There are many Afghan refugees living in his electorate. His name is Julian Hill. Now, there's some you might remember, I don't know if you do or not, but the Afghan war came to, or Australia's role in Afghanistan came to an end in 2021, and there was an evacuation of Australian soldiers and diplomats and personnel from Kabul airport, and many Afghan citizens who had helped Australians tried to leave with Australia at the same time. The whole thing was very chaotic and poorly managed. The Taliban was invading Kabul and everyone was just desperate to get out. And so it was a bit of a mess. Anyway, many Afghans were left behind. And if you, as an Afghani, if you had helped Americans or British or Australians, then the Taliban didn't really think very highly of you and your future would be pretty dismal. So Mr. Hill said we didn't really do enough to get our Afghan citizens or Afghan people out. And so he said, if you just follow the numbers here, this is exchanges during question time. Mr. Hill called out, "You're killing my constituents," his Afghan constituents. "You're killing my constituents," he said in response to Minister Karen Andrews' answer to a question. Karen Andrews was the Speaker, the Minister for Home Affairs. As a result of that, the Speaker, Tony Smith, ejected Mr. Hill from the Parliament, kicked him out. Now under Rule 94A, which is a temporary removal for a short period of time for unparliamentary conduct. Now, when he was kicked out, he's outside Parliament now, outside the chamber, and he's got his phone, of course, and he's on Twitter, and he posts, "True, I did say that," to all his Twitter followers. Now, as a response to that, he was named by the Speaker. Now, being named means that a member is not just ejected under 94A temporarily. Being named means that the House will now vote on whether to suspend them for a longer period of time, in this case 24 hours. So the Speaker, after the tweet became known, the Speaker said, "I name Julian Hill for unparliamentary conduct because of the tweet," and asked the House to vote on whether or not to suspend him. The House did 25-14 vote to suspend Mr. Hill for 24 hours. Mr. Hill is one of 2 MPs who were suspended by being named in the 46th Parliament. Really good example. Privileges committees are internal committees in both houses that hold the members of their houses to account for all kinds of things, really. So Parliament has many, many committees. As you know, it has standing committees for many, many things. And these committees are permanent standing committees. The House has one committee that looks out for how members behave and their financial interests, making sure that they declare, whether or not they have shares and houses and what have you, so that we can see how they're voting on legislation that might affect their own personal wealth. And that's important for accountability. We don't want them to have conflicts of interests, and that committee looks out for that. The Senate has 2 committees that do those 2 things, one for privileges and one for Senators' interests, but essentially they do the same thing. So what happens here is an MP may be referred by their House to the relevant committee, and that committee will then investigate their conduct or their interests and make a recommendation to the House about what should happen to them. It must be said from the outset that these are members of Parliament judging members of Parliament, and they tend to, House committees especially, are dominated by the government, so government MPs who are referred to it will not likely be held to account particularly strongly. Bottom line is these are very weak forms of accountability because it's members holding other members to account. It's too close. And so I think if you are answering any question about the relevant or the relative strength of these mechanisms, privileges committees must be ranked low. Okay, they're not very effective. We don't have many examples of them because they're not very effective. The last good one is in the textbook, and that's Craig Thompson. There's more to processes and procedures than privileges committees and others. There are many other parliamentary committees. I'm not going to go through all of this, just read this in your own time, but all the committees perform all of the functions pretty well, okay? So dwell on that slide for some time. Ministers cannot be members of a parliamentary committee, so there is an effective separation of powers there. Parliamentary committees uphold the responsible role of government. Okay, they make the Parliament able to hold the government accountable pretty well. They work inside closed doors and office rooms where there's no media, there's no public, so there's no real incentive for members of Parliament to act in a partisan point scoring type of way. So they just get down to business and do their job. Parliamentary committees are really good. They do all 3 functions really well. Finally, judicial review. So this is a judge on the left, the Constitution in the middle, and then some constitutional sections which are important for the review of Parliament. So section 51 is the long list of the Parliament's legislative and financial powers. There are 40 subsections there. The Commonwealth Parliament is different to the states. The states can legislate on anything they like. They have what are called plenary powers. They operate in the areas of residual power. They are barred from legislating in areas of exclusive Commonwealth power, but there are not many of those areas. They can legislate in all the concurrent and residual areas. So the Commonwealth Parliament, however, does not have plenary power. It must only legislate, or to be valid, its laws must be relevant to or reference to a constitutional head of power. So it's limited by a list of exclusive and concurrent powers. That's it. If it's not on that list, they can't do it. So Parliament can make laws which are unconstitutional. Sometimes they stand if no one challenges them. Unchallenged legislation, you would learn about that when you did federalism. But oftentimes laws, statutes are challenged if there's a hint that they may be beyond the power of the Parliament, and it's the judges who will decide that in the High Court. So declaring the legislation that falls outside of the legislative power of the Parliament is a really big form of judicial accountability, because once a bill, or a statute rather, is declared unconstitutional, that's it. It's as if it was never made. So Parliament can't make laws reliably that are unconstitutional. Next is the eligibility crisis that affected the 45th Parliament some time ago when Malcolm Turnbull was Prime Minister. A number of members of Parliament were entitled to or possessed dual citizenship. That resulted in many senators and members of the House effectively being excluded or kicked out of Parliament because they were ineligible to be elected in the first place under Section 44 of the Constitution. It was a big hoo-ha at the time, and it resulted in much closer vetting of members of Parliament, because the Constitution is the Constitution. It doesn't change just because the politicians want it to. The judges have decided that they're going to strictly enforce the Section 44 criteria, and the consequence is that there is a much higher level of accountability now on MPs or candidates even, making sure that their citizenship house is in order, so to speak, and they don't even attempt to get elected unless they are a single citizen of Australia and no other country. And finally, Section 7 and 24, both you would know from human rights, have contain implications for freedom of political speech, and therefore Parliament is prevented by implied rights to freedom of political communication from making any laws that would burden that freedom. That's what the courts are saying. They can't make laws which infringe that freedom. So a number of sections there you can use as evidence and examples for ways in which the High Court, especially because the High Court is the only one that can interpret the Constitution, can hold the Parliament accountable. Similar slide, but this time instead of the Constitution, it's just regular statutes. Here we have courts, any courts really, not just the High Court, can interpret statutes, Commonwealth statutes. Interpretations are ways of declaring the meaning of statutes. So Parliament's laws can sometimes be poorly drafted or out of date, and we see judges working hard to try to keep them up to date. If a statute is constantly needing to be interpreted all the time, that will signal to the Parliament that it's time to do something about that, and maybe it's time to repeal it and legislate something new or amend it in some way. So in this way, the courts are alerting Parliament to the fact that some statutes might not be working too well. You know from Year 11 that the judges apply rules and maxims of interpretation. They're listed there in the brown box, orange box. These are ways in which the Parliament knows that the good judges are going to read the laws in these ways, so they had better make sure that they write or construct the statutes in ways that the judges are going to be able to make sense of. And finally, there is the principle of legality. This is a default position that judges interpret laws in ways that will uphold rights. The little clock there going backwards is to indicate retrospective laws. It is constitutional to make them in Australia, but unless the Parliament is really specific in its language in a statute, then the courts will interpret it in a way that is not retrospective. So the principle of legality, there's a couple of quotes there. Lord Hoffman some time ago said, the principle of legality means that Parliament must squarely confront what it is doing and accept the political cost. Fundamental rights cannot be overridden by general or ambiguous words. So that's a warning from a judge to the Parliament. Do not expect to be able to avoid paying the political price through the elections for making bad law. Down the bottom, a judge in Australia's High Court some time ago in Potter versus Minahan said, it is in the last degree improbable that the legislature would overthrow fundamental principles, infringe rights, or depart from the general system of law without expressing its intention with irresistible clearness. So the bottom line here is that judges demand that the laws are clear, concise, consistent, and very, very crystal clear in their intention. Okay, here is an example of a recent case from, was actually started last year but finished in 2022. Dalil Alexander is a joint Australian national, joint Australian Turkish Australian citizen. He left Australia, joined a terrorist organisation called ISIS, which is outlawed by Australian law. When he was over there, he was stripped of his Australian citizenship by the Minister for Home Affairs, which is allowable under the Citizenship Act made by Parliament. So Parliament gave the Minister the power to strip Australian citizens, if they have dual citizenship, of their Australian citizenship if they behave in ways that are against Australia's national interest. Now, Mr. Dalil, or Mr. Alexander rather, was pardoned by Syria, but he cannot be deported back to Australia because he doesn't have Australian citizenship anymore. So he's not guilty of any crime, and yet he's languishing in a Syrian jail, which must be a pretty awful place to be. So Mr. Alexander's sister challenged the Citizenship Act, Section 36B, and he said that the minister was actually punishing him by stripping him of his Australian citizenship. And the argument was that ministers cannot punish, only courts can punish, because that is a judicial function. And therefore, Parliament, when it gave the minister the power to punish, is actually stepping outside its constitutional limits, that it doesn't have the power to give a minister the power to strip an Australian of their Australian citizenship, because that is a punishment and only courts can punish. Now, that case was successful. Parliament did act beyond its power according to the High Court, and Section 36B of the citizenship is invalid. Mr. Alexander's Australian citizenship was restored to him. He's likely to be deported to Australia, where he will face Australia's criminal justice system. So basically, in the top right-hand corner there, Parliament cannot place in the hands of a minister a power that is strictly a judicial power. This case is similar to other cases such as Boilermakers, Brandy's, and others, where the courts have defended their own powers against intrusion by the Parliament. Here is some advice. Very easy to confuse a question about the accountability with a question about the accountability of the executive. Don't confuse Parliament and the executive. That will be very costly if you do that in an essay. Make sure you are addressing the Parliament and not the executive, or vice versa, when you're answering these questions. Do use evidence and examples when you respond to questions. You can't get high marks without them. And finally, there is a dot point list there of some, by no means not all, of some of the contemporary issues related to political and legal power that have been covered over the last couple of years of this course. And these contemporary issues provide a wealth of evidence and examples for use in essays and high mark questions. So good luck with your exams, your mocks and your WACE exams at the end of the year. And thank you for paying attention.